Last time we spoke about the Nanchang and Autumn Harvest Uprisings. On August the 1st, during the Nanchang Uprising, the CCP's Second Front Army inflicted heavy casualties and seized substantial weaponry. Reorganized under Xueliang and Ying, the army, then 20,000 strong, celebrated Nanchang, attracting new recruits. However, faced with imminent counterattacks, they retreated south in what became known as the Little Long March. Despite initial successes like capturing Weicheng County, internal strife and harsh conditions reduced their numbers significantly. By the end of August, they reached Guangdong, but relentless opposition from nationalist forces led to severe losses. The remaining forces retreated east, encountering brutal battles and a final devastating defeat. Scattered, the remnants sought refuge and eventually regrouped, with leaders like Zhou Enlai and He navigating exile and adversity. The uprising marked the CCP's first armed resistance against the KMT, a prelude to continued revolutionary efforts, notably the Autumn Harvest Uprising. Amidst widespread strategic shifts in CCP policy and leadership, including Mao Zedong's influential role. This episode is the Guangzhou, Gansu and Red Spear Uprisings. Welcome back to the Fall and Rise of China podcast. I'm your dutiful host, Craig Watson. But before we begin, I just wanted to remind you all that this podcast is only made possible through the efforts of Kings and Generals over at YouTube. Perhaps you want to learn a bit more about the history of Asia? Kings and Generals has an assortment of episodes on the history of Asia and so much more, so go give them a look over at YouTube. So please subscribe to Kings and Generals over at YouTube and continue to help us produce this content by checking out www.patreon.com/kingsandgenerals. And hey, don't forget about our sister podcast over at the Pacific War Week by Week podcast, written and narrated by me. And if after all that, if you're still hungry for some more history, why don't you check out my personal channel, the Pacific War channel, found at YouTube and all major podcast platforms. For podcasts, I just released a new episode with my co-host, where we looked at the best and worst generals of World War II from each nation. As for YouTube, I am now releasing a brand new episode with a new animator on board, and this episode is the first in a new series about Japan's invasion of North China, this episode being Operation Nika, the battle for Ruhe. I was only able to fund a new animator because of my Patreon account, which can be found at www.patreon.com/thepacificwarchannel. Over there, for as little as $2 a month, you get access to the exclusive Patreon podcast, early access to all of the content I make, and voting rights for what I will tackle next. Last we left off, the Nanchang and Autumn Harvest Uprising saw mixed, to let's be honest, kind of lackluster results. Both certainly saw their hardships for the passionate people involved. Countless gave their lives for a cause they truly believed in. This was China's warlord era, so many differing groups made grand promises for bright futures, such as warlords, the KMT, and of course the CCP. The CCP, having undergone the White Terror, now sought to unleash their own independent revolution, now released by the shackles of the KMT. On the 7th, the CCP Central Committee held an emergency meeting where Chen Duxiu was criticized for his appeasement of the KMT right wing. It was also during this meeting the CCP formalized how they would go about implementing a land revolution and armed uprisings. The CCP then received strong suggestions from one Joseph Stalin that they should unleash a major uprising to seize control over a province, hinting at performing such a deed in Guangzhou in the hopes of taking Guangdong. In accordance, the head of the CCP, Chu Bai, decided they needed to persuade soldiers to their cause to perform such a thing. Many within the CCP leadership did not support such plans, deeming the chance of winning control over a province to be highly unlikely, but their Soviet advisors were strongly pushing for it. On the 20th, Zhang Tailei, the secretary of Guangdong CCP Provincial Committee, discussed plans for a provincial-wide uprising. They would mobilize the workers and peasants to hold riots in key locations within Guangdong, particularly Guangzhou. The ultimate plan was to seize Guangdong by establishing uprising committees in Beijiang, Shijiang, and Guangzhou. In early October, the Nanchang Uprising suffered tremendous losses at Chaoan and Shandong. The setback changed the minds of those seeking to seize all of Guangdong, and instead they directed their efforts to mobilizing workers in Guangzhou to carry out political and economic struggles. On November the 17th, within Guangdong and Guangxi, petty warlords began a little war. This was between the KMT-aligned warlords Zhang Fakui and Li Jishen. The CCP Central Committee believed this little war was a major opportunity, and they jumped to exploit it. Zhang Zongchang was vulnerable in particular. He was colluding with Wang Jingwei at the time. His primary job was to eliminate the pervading influence of the CCP in the Guangzhou area. Zhang Zongchang's troops continuously rounded up suspected communists and kept a close eye on the Soviet consulate at all times. Zhang Zongchang's troops were more or less brutalizing the common people, not a very tasteful job by any means, and one that really demoralized their troops. The CCP played upon the low standard of living and economic instability of warlord-era China, hoping to appeal to the masses for a Soviet communist-style system rather than what the KMT was proposing. Here is just a taste of some of the slogans they wrote on placards and proclaimed in major city centers. Raise the soldiers' pay to 20 silver dollars. Food for the workers. Land to the tillers. Knock down the KMT and the warlords. Kill all the country bullies and the evil landlords. Confiscate the capitalist homes and give them to the rebel masses. All authority to the workers, peasants, and soldiers. They also passed the Resolution of Guangdong Work Plan. This would require that the Guangdong Provincial Party Committee expand some riots using workers and peasants within the cities and villages, incite soldiers to mutiny and resist the war, and hopefully direct all said into a general riot to seize power. They would first begin by mobilizing farmers to refuse to pay winter rent and riot if they could. On November the 26th, Zhang Zongchang went to Guangzhou from Hong Kong covertly and convened a secret meeting with the CCP members there. During these meetings, it was decided they would take advantage of Zhang Zongchang's troops, who were currently very demoralized from fighting battles they honestly wanted nothing to do with. Within Guangzhou was the 4th Army Teaching Corps, and part of the Guards Corps amongst smaller CCP militia groups. Zhang Zongchang would act as a chairman. Wang Ping and Zhou Wenyang would all lead the uprising. After the meeting, Zhang Zongchang and the others went to the Teaching Corps and Guards Corps to mobilize them, as well as begin training some worker Red Guards who formed into 7 regiments and 2 death squads, with Zhou Wenyang as their commander-in-chief. The 4th Army Teaching Corps was reorganized from a KMT political school, with Yi Jianan as their leader. In early December, Comintern agent Heinz Neumann arrived in Guangdong to add to the uprising. It's said he had a large influence on the committee and took a leading role in what happened. Yi Jianan formed a communist infiltration cadet regiment roughly 1,200 men strong. They would form the core of the army. Added to this was the ad hoc Red Guard of about 2,000 armed workers. On December the 6th, the Guangdong Provincial Committee, chaired by Zhang Zongchang, approved the declaration and letter to the people, as well as made arrangements for an establishment of a Soviet government in Guangzhou. They all decided to enact the uprising on December the 12th. In the meantime, the headquarters and staff for the uprising was established. Yu Ting would be the commander-in-chief, and Yu Jianying would be his deputy. On the eve of the uprising, Wang Jingwei and Zhang Zongchang both became aware of the impending uprising, so they immediately began disbanding the teaching units, imposed martial law in Guangzhou, and transferred their main forces back to Guangzhou. The CCP found out the jig was up, so they unleashed the uprising ahead of schedule on the morning of the 11th. At around 3:30 a.m., under the leadership of Zhang Zongchang, Yu Ting, Wang Ping, Zhou Wenyang, Yu Jianying, and Yang Ying, the entire teaching regiment, part of the Guard Regiment, and the armed worker Red Guards, totaling about 5,000 people, 2,000 of which were Red Guards, launched a surprise attack upon key points in Guangzhou from several directions. It is said that some Russian Soviets, Koreans, and Vietnamese in Guangzhou also participated in the uprising. I read that last one from a single source, and I actually kind of doubt it. It is a CCP source. In fact, evidence suggests the CCP leadership was extremely mixed on the uprising. Commanders Yu Ting, Yu Jianying, and Xu Jiangqian strongly suggested against going through with it, arguing they were too badly armed to even have a remote chance of success. Only 2,000 of them even had rifles. The CCP began first by seducing troops of Zhang Zongchang. The first units to enter the city were the infamous Dare to Die units. As the name suggests, these men were like a suicidal vanguard. They stormed police stations, seized their weapons and cars. They also took control over city buses and trucks to spread the incoming Red Army units throughout the city as quickly as possible. Along the eastern route, under the direct command of Yu Ting, the main force quickly defeated an infantry regiment stationed at Shaohu, capturing 600 prisoners, numerous small firearms, and eliminated an artillery regiment stationed at Yangtang. On the middle route, part of the teaching regiment and Red Guards captured the KMT Guangdong Provincial Government Building, sitting on the commanding heights of the Guangying Mountain, known today as Yuexiao Mountain. On the southern route, the 3rd Battalion of the Guards Regiment and Red Guards attacked the headquarters of the 4th Army and their arsenal, but encountered stiff resistance and were unable to capture them. Meanwhile, peasants in Fangtun, Shitun, and the suburbs of Guangzhou launched uprisings, with some gaining urban worker cooperation. Within 4 hours of battle, the uprising was providing results, excluding the headquarters of the 4th Army. The armory, rear office of the 12th Division of the 4th Army, the police forces, and the urban area north of the Pearl River was all secured. They took control over governmental buildings, the central bank, which at that time had a very large silver reserve and numerous barracks. To suppress any resistance, they began grabbing KMT troops who refused to comply, and they executed them in public in the streets. They also marked and burnt down the residence of KMT officials. They had eliminated numerous enemies and captured 20 artillery pieces and about 1,000 small arms. That same day, members of the new Soviet government of Guangzhou was formed, with Xu Jiaozhang becoming its chairman. Upon establishing the Guangzhou Soviet, they declared a letter to the people with decrees. Meanwhile, during the outbreak of hostilities, Chen Guangbo, the chairman of the KMT Guangdong Provincial Government, Zhang Fukuai, Huang Qixiang, the commander of the 4th Army, and the other KMT officials hastily fled to the headquarters of Li Fulin's 5th Army stationed over at Haizhong Temple on the south bank of the Pearl River. There they ordered the 12th Division, the 78th Regiment of the 26th Division, the 12th Division in Dongjiang, and the 1st and 2nd Regiment of the 1st Training Division in Shangde to march upon Guangzhou. This saw roughly 15,000 NRA troops converging upon the city. On the 12th, more than 3 of Zhang Fukuai's divisions and part of Li Fulin's 5th Army assembled along the southern bank of the Pearl River with the support of British, American, French, and Japanese warships and Marines. They prepared a counterattack from the east, west, and south. The Communists fought desperately against much superior forces in terms of numbers, training, and equipment. They suffered tremendous losses, including the death of Jiang Teilei. Zhang Fukuai's troops arrived one after another, gradually surrounding the city. At a critical moment, the CCP leadership called for a retreat from the city to preserve the forces that they had left. The surviving 1,000 Reds fled Guangzhou in the early hours of the 13th, whereupon they were reorganized into the 4th Red Division. They fled to Waishuan, then Haifeng, and Lufenggan, where they joined others performing uprisings in Dongjiang and Yujiang areas. A few survivors went to Shaoguan, joining survivors of the Nanchang Uprising led by Zhu De and Chen Yi. After the KMT secured Guangzhou, they carried out a bloody suppression of anyone suspected of being a communist or even sympathetic to the cause. The CCP estimated that perhaps more than 5,700 people were killed. The Soviet consulate in Guangzhou was also attacked at around 8 p.m. on the 13th. All of its personnel were arrested, and according to the testimony of one Soviet consul, Bokovlensky, diplomats Ukolov and Ivanov, each of them had a sign tied to their body that read, "Russian Communist. Anyone can punish him at will." Along the way, people threw things at them, hit them, stabbed them with knives, and spit on them. They both would be later shot, alongside the deputy consul named Aziz. Yu Ting was scapegoated, purged, and blamed for the failure of the Guangzhou uprising, despite the fact he was one of the commanders who argued it should have never been done in the first place. Enraged by how he was treated, Yu Ting fled China and went into exile in Europe. Although the Nanchang, Autumn Harvest, and Guangzhou uprisings had all failed to achieve their primary objectives, they did, however, kindle a fire within China. Rather than become demoralized and just wither away, the communists pushed even more uprisings, and these would grow each year. They began what the CCP refers to as the 10-year Civil War, a period that will end in 1936. Now, we're actually going to be taking a little break from the Chinese Civil War until we hit the early 1930s. But there have been quite a lot of events overshadowed by the Northern Expedition. I, of course, can't get into everything that was going on in China during the late 1920s, but I thought it'd be a good idea to try and tackle a few of the big ones. If you all remember, all the way back when I was listing the different warlord cliques, one of them was the Ma clique. Fang Yusung's Guomingjun had been shoved into the northwest after the Anti-Fangxian War, and one province his men began to oversee was Gansu. At the time, famine, natural disasters, and the forced seizure of farming land for opium cultivation drove the people of Gansu to rebel. Two Hui Muslim generals, Ma Ying and Ma Xang, exploited the situation to perform a revolt against the Kuomintang in 1928. Prior to this, there had been a lot of ethnic religious fighting within the province of Guangzhou. An American botanist named James Rock wrote accounts of how he saw fighting between the Hui Muslims led by the warlord Ma Qi and Tibetan Buddhists at the Labrang Monastery. Back in 1917, Tibetans in the Shunhua had rebelled against Ma Anyang because of overtaxation. Ma Anyang did not report this to the Bang government and was reprimanded for not doing so, seeing Ma Qi sent by the Bang government to investigate and suppress the rebellion. Ma Qi commanded the Yinghai army in Qinghai and used his forces to seize the Labrang Monastery in 1917. This was the first time non-Tibetans had taken the monastery. Because of this, ethnic religious riots broke out between Muslims and Tibetans, seeing Ma Qi defeat the Tibetans. Afterwards, he heavily taxed the town of Labrang for over 8 years and repeatedly quelled uprisings. In 1921, he crushed Tibetan monks trying to retake the monastery. In 1925, a full-blown Tibetan rebellion broke out, seeing thousands attacking Hui Muslims. Ma Qi responded by deploying 3,000 troops who quickly retook Labrang and machine-gunned thousands of Tibetans trying to flee the scene. Ma Qi would besiege Labrang numerous times, seeing Hui Muslims, Mongols, and Tibetans all fighting for control over Labrang, but by 1927, Ma Qi finally gave it all up. Ma Qi became the governor of Qinghai, and he simply moved on. However, that was not the last Labrang would see of General Ma Qi. The Hui forces looted and ravaged the monastery again, and in revenge, Tibetans skinned alive many Hui soldiers. One of the most common practices was to slice open the stomach of a living soldier and then put hot rocks inside said stomach. Many Hui women were sold to ethnic Han and Kazakhs. Children were adopted by the Tibetans. Now, come 1927, Feng Yusung became the governor of Guangzhou, and to control the region, Feng Yusung incorporated and promoted Hui Muslim generals within his Kuomintang. Feng Yusung placed Liu Yufan with 15,000 troops to act as governor while he jumped into the northern expedition. There was a particularly nasty earthquake that year, followed by a drought and then a famine. Liu Yufan responded to the situation by overtaxing the populace. During the later half of the northern expedition, Zhang Zongchang fomented any rebellious fires he could amongst his enemies, and he could see within Guangzhou there was an opportunity to exploit. He began sending shipments of weapons to the son of Ma Anyang, Ma Xingxiang, who unleashed a revolt against Liu Yufan, Yangzhou. The revolt soon spread, and this saw Ma Xingxiang unleash a siege against Hezhou in the spring of 1928. To support the siege, Ma Zhongying recruited Hui, Dongxiang, and sailor Muslims, forming an army nearly 10,000 strong. By November, the Hezhou besiegers numbered about 25,000, and they were beginning to starve. So the men were directed towards the Tao River Valley in the south, where they began slaughtering Tibetan monks. They burned the place of the Tibetan Susi chief king Yang Jianan after defeating his 3,000-man strong army and sacked the Tibetan city of Chon. The Tibetan areas south of Guangzhou were laid to waste. At Taozhou, Tibetan militias tried to fight off the force of Mao Xingxiang, but they were defeated. However, they did inflict severe casualties upon Mao Xingxiang's forces. This only emboldened more atrocities, seeing Muslim forces burn printing presses and temples of the Tibetan Buddhists in Chon. The Muslims then looted the Gompa. For those who don't know, Gompa is a sacred Buddhist spiritual compound. It's sort of like a Buddhist university. And there they massacred the Tibetan Buddhist monks of the Labrang Monastery again. The Austrian-born botanist Joseph Rock witnessed much of the carnage and even found himself stuck in a battle in 1929. He described seeing Muslim armies leaving behind Tibetan skeletons over wide areas and decorating the Labrang Monastery with severed Tibetan heads. During the 1929 battle at Shahe near Labrang, severed Tibetan heads were apparently used as ornaments by Hui Muslim troops within their camps. Rock stated this: "How the heads of young girls and children were staked around the encampment. 10 to 15 heads were fastened to the saddle of every Muslim cavalryman. The heads were strung about the walls of the Muslim garrison with a garland of flowers." The blood flowed until 1929 when Liao Yufan, with support of Fang Yusung, finally drove off their forces. It's estimated up to 2 million people died in a war across Gansu. Ma Qingxiang tried to defect to Chiang Kai-shek, but would find himself captured later by Fang Yusung, who executed him. And another notable rebellion would break out in the good old province of Shandong, because where else, right? You may remember me talking about a small group known as the Red Spear Society. They were a movement made up of peasants who formed self-defense militias during China's warlord era. There were numerous branches, but the largest one was in Shandong, particularly within the Laiyang County. They, of course, were so numerous in Shandong because of our old friend, the dog-meat general, Zhang Zongchang. Zhang Zongchang notoriously abused the populace of Shandong with gross mismanagement, overtaxation, and, well, pure banditry. And let's be honest, Shandong keeps raising its head through this podcast series. It's basically the melting pot for uprisings. In the fall of 1928, banditry rose exponentially across the Shandong Peninsula, leading to more and more villages joining the Red Spear Society trying to defend themselves. Meanwhile, with Zhang Zongchang defeated and tossed into exile in Dalian, his subordinate, Leo Janan, became the new ruler of the province. Yao Jianan had defected to the KMT at the very last moment, betraying his master so he could steal his fiefdom. Leo Janan's rule was just as bad, if not worse, than the dog-meat general. He overtaxed the population, though a little less than Zhang Zongchang, mind you. He used his personal army to brutalize the population. Many of his troops simply became bandits looting and pillaging the countryside. All of this further antagonized the Red Spear Society. In 1928, the Red Spear Society organized a militant tax resistance, causing Yao Jianan's officials to fear even going near a village, particularly at Laiyang or Jiaoyuan, where there's large concentrations of Red Spears. Now, the Red Spears were not the only problem that hit Shandong in the 1920s. Our good friend Zhang Zongchang, exiled in Dalian, could not take it anymore, and he wanted to seize back his power base from his former subordinate. He formed a plot to perform an uprising in Shandong with the help of Chu Yupe and Huang Fangti. Zhang Zongchang first enlisted the help of some of his former White Russian commanders, Generals Grigory Semyonov and Konstantin Petrovich Nekiev. Zhang Zongchang's plan was to recapture Shandong, rested upon the tens of thousands of his former soldiers still within the province. Many of them had not joined the NRA, and instead tossed their lot in with the local bandits. Within quite a precarious economic situation, without a real leader, many of them were willing to come back to their old master. These men were certainly not in the best shape, however. They were demoralized, they lacked weapons and training, but they did have one thing going on for them. Their war was to be against Liao Jianan's forces and not the crack NRA troops. Liao Jianan's forces were technically part of the NRA, but in reality they were just a bunch of undertrained Fangtian troops who had no real allegiance to the new nationalist government. They had zero support from the population of Shandong, whom they terrorized. Zhang Zongchang would also have the financial backing of Japan for this little venture. When Zhang Zongchang came over to Shandong, this caused Liao Jianan's garrison units at Longkou and Huangshan to mutiny late in January of 1929. The local commanders Liao Kantai, Xu Tianpin, Liu Shutong, and Cao Pengqi all began working to overthrow Liao Jianan. They renounced their allegiance to the KMT and they began to revolt. A roughly 3,000 men strong army consisting of Zhang Zongchang's former Shandong troops and some ex-Zhuli forces began to loot and pillage Longkou, Huangshan, and Dongzhou. The foreign communities in these parts fled to 2 Japanese warships at harbor. The Imperial Japanese Navy then sent a squadron to protect their citizens in the area. This was soon followed up by 20,000 troops of Yao Jianan. However, instead of facing Liao Jianan's men, the mutineers fled into areas defended by the Red Spears. The mutineers and Red Spears formed an alliance, and they prepared for a defensive against Longkou. In February, the rebels gained the upper hand and pushed Liao Jianan into the Juifu area in northeastern Shandong. On February the 19th, Zhang Zongchang, Chu Yupe, and Huang Fangti landed at Longkou with a small detachment. The mutineers promptly joined their old master, and they set up a new HQ in Dongzhou. From there they marched upon Jifu. 50 miles short of Jifu, Zhang Zongchang's now 5,000-man strong army ran to Liao Jianan's near Fushan. Zhang Zongchang was hopelessly outnumbered, but luckily Huang Fangti had spent most of February recruiting their old comrades and he managed to assemble about 26,000 troops. Meanwhile, Leo Janan now had fewer troops than Zhang Zongchang, and his KMT backers did not support him very much. What he did receive from the KMT was 200,000 rounds of ammunition and roughly 50,000 yuan for military funding. Furthermore, he was impaired by the presence of the Imperial Japanese Navy, who were secretly supporting Zhang Zongchang by not allowing NRA reinforcements into the area. After a series of skirmishes, Zhang Zongchang arrived at Jifu with a force of nearly 25,000 men, while Yao Jianan only had 7,000 men left to defend the town. On February the 21st, the two sides clashed, and surprisingly, it was Zhang Zongchang who lost. Despite their numbers, they simply were not armed well enough to fight an army who enjoyed fortifications. Another issue they faced was the fact Zhang Zongchang was not even present during the battle. Zhang Zongchang had suffered 500 casualties, roughly 200 deaths, and 300 captured. Perhaps worse, he lost nearly 3,000 rifles and 15 machine guns. He pulled back his army to Guangzhou, undaunted by the defeat. Zhang Zongchang's troops then began pillaging the local population. Zhang Zongchang began negotiations with Leo Janan, trying to convince him to surrender. Certainly, Leo Janan was not in a good state. By February the 25th, roughly 15,000 of his troops near the area of Weihaiwei had defected to Zhang Zongchang. By the end of the month, Zhang Zongchang effectively controlled eastern Shandong. It was around early March when Zhang Zongchang announced a new warlord coalition consisting of himself, Chu Yupu, Qi Shiyuan, Wu Peifu, Bei Chongxi, Yan Xishan, and countless Fengtian commanders who would soon launch a campaign to defeat the KMT. You're probably thinking to yourself, some of these names don't make much sense. Why would they join old dog meat? Well, that's because they didn't. He simply made the entire thing up, because he had something cooking up in Beijing. Zhang Zongchang sought to foment an anti-KMT movement in North China. On March the 2nd, 20 armed men wearing civilian clothing suddenly disarmed the Shanxi army guards at the Yonghu Temple. These men then fired into the air, signaling a regiment loyal to Zhang Zongchang to perform a mutiny. The mutineers quickly manned the temple walls, barricaded themselves in, and seized control over nearby fortifications. From their vantage point, they began shooting at the local populace, causing a lot of panic and disorder. Then, at lightning speed, the KMT forces within Beijing surrounded the Yonghu Temple and forced the mutineers to surrender. Only 2 mutineers were killed, 35 were wounded, but a lot of civilians had been hurt. Despite being a bit comical, if you think about it, the Beijing revolt, as it became known, received a lot of news press. The Nanjing government then took some steps to prevent any more Shandong NRA troops from joining the rebels. Meanwhile, back over in eastern Shandong, Zhang Zongchang's troops had literally razed 6 large towns and 50 villages to the ground, apparently in retaliation because someone tried to assassinate Zhang Zongchang. It did not take too long for those back under the dog meat general's rule to want to kill him. He was back to his old brutal ways, going even above and beyond. It was said that captured women were being sold as slaves at Huangxian for about 10 to 20 Mexican dollars. One of Zhang Zongchang's commanders, General Shandong, had his forces plunder Laizhou before returning to the front lines around Jifu. Yao Jianan's forces were likewise looting, albeit on a smaller scale. Yao Jianan was also ignoring orders from Chiang Kai-shek to control his men and to act in accordance with NRA protocols, i.e., no raping, looting, and such. The civilian population of Jifu were so brutalized, many simply fled for Dalian. There emerged a growing international concern for the foreign community in eastern Shandong. Several foreign warships began to anchor there. Meanwhile, the Red Spear Society was occupying parts of Shandong's hinterland, as countless villages and towns joined them for protection. The Red Spear Society were not the only ones forming local self-defense forces. Being Shandong, the act of doing so had been as ancient as time itself. A lot of irregular armed groups rose up, such as the 2,000-man-strong army led by Wang Shuqiang, known as the Southern Army, and another force calling themselves the White Spear Society. This group was explicitly raised to defend local villages from Zhang Zongchang's men, but quickly found themselves under attack from local armed groups as well. The White Spears, like the Red Spears, formed a power base in Shandong's hinterland. By early March, Zhang Zongchang and Yao Jianan agreed to a 5-day ceasefire. Zhang Zongchang followed this up by trying to bribe Leo Janan to defect back to him. He offered him 100,000 yuan, but in Leo Janan's words, "I thought my loyalty was worth at least 500,000 yuan. Zhang Zongchang was unwilling to pay that much, so Leo Janan remained on the side of the KMT. Thus both parties gathered more troops to do battle, Once the 5 days were over, Zhang Zongchang attacked Jifu again. While under siege, Leo Janan received 7,000 reinforcements from a local warlord named Sun Ying. Unfortunately, soon after, one of Leo Janan's regimental commanders, Colonel Yang, defected to Zhang Zongchang, opening the gates of the city. Leo Janan's forces managed to retreat in good order eastwards as Zhang Zongchang began brutalizing the local population. A 6-day-long spree of rape, murder, and looting devastated Jifu. By March 28th, the Japanese and KMT government signed an agreement resulting in the departure of Japanese forces from Shandong. Meanwhile, Leo Janan's army fled to Muping, where they found themselves yet again under siege. Yao Jianan sortied to attack his assailants, inflicting 2,000 casualties. As the siege progressed, Leo Janan offered to surrender on April 4th, but Zhang Zongchang refused, thinking he had everything won in the bag. Unfortunately for Zhang Zongchang, his men gradually sought to plunder the undefended countryside rather than maintain the siege, greatly reducing his strength. During a final attempt to take Muping on April 22nd, Zhang Zongchang's army was routed. Liao Jianan launched a counteroffensive, forcing most of Zhang Zongchang's men into the countryside. Countless simply became bandits again. Zhang Zongchang's big attempt to retake the province had completely crumbled. Zhang Zongchang yet again fled to Dalian, leaving Chu Yupu with just under 5,000 men. Chu Yupu fled to Fushan, where he took its 20,000 inhabitants hostage. For 13 days, Chu Yupu was besieged by NRA forces. During those 13 days, Chu Yupu's men raped, murdered, and looted. Apparently, they tied up over 400 women and children and used them as human shields during the siege as well. Chu Yupu eventually surrendered, whereupon numerous women and girls committed suicide, having been raped and become pregnant. Over 1,500 NRA and 2,000 rebels were reportedly killed during the siege of Fushan. The city had been plundered heavily for 13 days and was then plundered by the besiegers. Chu Yupu had secured a secret deal with the KMT to be allowed to go into exile in Korea with $400,000 worth of silver. It pays to be evil. Now again, back to those Red Spears. By the summer of 1929, they had ballooned into what was effectively a proto-state around Guangzhou. They had established a magistrate, taken over all the local administration, and introduced land and head taxes to fund themselves, which is ironic. Within their territory, they refused to pay governmental taxes. They introduced a forced conscription of at least one member of each family. The taxes they collected funded buying arms and ammunition, and any NRA or KMT officials who came near were shot on sight. It got to the point if anyone was caught speaking without the local dialect, they were simply turned away. By August, they were roughly 60,000 strong, and they were far too large for Leo Janan not to deal with any longer. On September the 23rd, Leo Janan unleashed an encirclement campaign between Guangzhou and Huangshan, performing a scorched earth policy. His troops destroyed 18 villages and largely burned down another 60, killing everyone they encountered, whether it be man, woman, or child. By November, the Red Spears in the area ceased to exist. It was just another sunny day in Shandong. I would like to take this time to remind all of you that this podcast is only made possible through the efforts of Kings and Generals over at YouTube. Please go subscribe to Kings and Generals over at YouTube and continue to help us produce this content by checking out www.patreon.com/kingsandgenerals. And hey, don't forget about our sister podcast over at the Pacific War Week by Week podcast, written and narrated by me. And if after all of that, if you're still hungry for some more history, why don't you check out my personal channel, the Pacific War channel, found at YouTube and all major podcast platforms. For podcasts, I just released Part 7 in my ongoing series on the North Africa campaign during World War II. Over on YouTube, I just released the first episode in a brand new series covering the Japanese invasion of North China, this episode being Operation Nika, the battle for Ruhe. That episode has work done by the new animator I hired using funds from my Patreon account, which can be found at www.patreon.com/thepacificwarchannel. Over there, for as little as $2 a month, you get access to the exclusive Patreon podcast, early access to all the content I make, and voting rights for what it will tackle next. A huge thanks to all of you who have already joined up. The Guangzhou Uprising was another testament to the lengths the CCP would go to try and carve out a new communist China. The Gansu and Red Spear uprisings were just a few amongst countless tales of the absolute mayhem and chaos that was China's warlord era, when the real victims were always the same, the common people of China.